Okay, recording now. Sorry about that. Okay, so yeah, characterizing main characters, player character, character controlled by the player, duh. As I said before, one of the most important narrative aspects of your game. The games are usually either named after them or they're a very big part of, like, the branding, the marketing. It's very much about the characters. And that makes sense because, like, as human beings, we like to connect to other people or at least other characters, things that feel like people. It's just like part of human nature. We connect very much, we get a lot more invested in character driven stories. So that's usually a very important part of your narrative. And it does also help with the immersion in your game. And immersion is a very important part of any sort of game. It's usually why people play games, to sort of like escape into another reality, the whole sort of getting lost in the game sort of experience. This is especially important for narrative driven games where, like, the point of the game is to experience like a different perspective, a new world, all those sorts of things. So like how you achieve this sort of immersion differs from game to game. It very much depends on what you want to do with your game. And it's very hard because of that to sort of like give any tips or pointers on how to achieve immersion, but it's very, very easy to tell when it's gone. So I'm sure you've all had some experience where, like, you're playing a game, having a great time, and then you just saw like some bug, some weird like pathfinding in the AI, a visual glitch, something like that, that just threw everything off, where you just look at that and you go like, what is going on? And then like you're very much aware that you're playing a game now. So that's sort of like those immersion breaking things that you might hear about from time to time. And like, so immersion, it's very much a combined effort of like everything that goes into game design, the controls, how the combat feels, story, level design, all that sort of stuff. But we're specifically going to be talking about characters, specifically player characters, and how like you can achieve immersion through two different ways, like through two different philosophies, I guess you could call it, of player character characterization. So the first one is fairly common, not very much so anymore, but it's the blank slate character. I'm sure you like know. I'm sure you have some idea about like what that means. Sorry, something happened on my screen. So it's basically characters that have very little, if any, characterization. They don't have very much dialogue. They may not even have a name. They're just kind of like a puppet that the player controls. Oh, chat. There you go. What is happening? I want to see chat. What do you mean Google Slides can't turn on your microphone?
I just said Half-Life has that in it.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I don't know. Zoom is being stupid, as it usually is. Okay. Anyways, but yeah, so little characterization. It's just like puppet that the player uses to interact with your game. That's basically it. So the way that blank slate characters facilitate immersion is via this thing called projection, where basically it's kind of like the puppet interaction thing, but a little bit on a deeper level. Where like if you've ever played a game and you've started referring to your actions in the first person, that's a pretty good sign that projection is going on. Where you're like, I just killed that boss. I just got thrown halfway across the map, all that stuff. You are experiencing like the player's actions and things that happen to the character, like as if it was yourself, I guess. And Blank slate is like very, very popular and very common in certain game genres. The first big ones are like FPS and sandbox games that don't have a lot of narrative, where the point of the game is like outside of the narrative, where it's like so like in most first person shooter games or like a lot of those battle sim games, like the point of the game is, you know, combative. It's I'm blanking on the word, but like the point isn't to get into like a huge narrative story thing. And similar with like sandbox games like Minecraft, like I have here, the point of the game is to create and to just see what you can do. There's not really much of a story, so you don't need like very much beyond basic characterization. And another thing that these come up with commonly is role playing games, specifically ones that are like very much build your own narrative, like Fallout, Skyrim, all of those ones where like it's very much focused on player choice and it's about being whoever you want to be, acting however you want to act. As the screenshot that I pulled here kind of demonstrates, you have two very different choices and the game gives you both of those choices. You don't get, you know, any sort of character like of like, you know, the person you're playing. It's very much what you would say. So that's kind of what they focus on. So naturally, there are pros and cons to each. So the pros, again, it enhances the immersion of the player. It also allows for more substantial or more meaningful player choice, or at least choices that feel more meaningful and they feel more impactful to the game's story, especially if you're doing something like, you know, Fallout or Skyrim, where the point is for the player to make their own story. It's also good for more gameplay focused games like the combative ones, like your sandboxes. And most importantly, from a development standpoint, it's usually much easier, depending on the game. If you're going for like those role playing, player can be anything, you have to make like all those dialogue options and like different interactions depending on their thing. So in that case, it would not be easier, but for games like in the first category, like your FPS games, your war sim games, your sandbox games, it's a lot easier because then you don't have to worry about making a character alongside everything else. But some of the cons is that it can like decrease the investment overall in your game because, like I said, we as human beings, we like to experience stories in our entertainment. It's like the biggest form of entertainment, and for a good reason. So we'd like to get invested in stories and characters. So long-term investment probably not going to happen very well with a blank slate character. It also doesn't mesh very well with character-driven stories. Again, pretty obvious. If there's no character, then it's hard to have a character-driven story. And yeah, I meant to have another point here, but I apparently didn't write it down, and now I can't remember it. So we'll get back to that later. And then as a contrast to blank slate characters, we have defined characters, which are fully characterized, fully realized characters. They're basically like just people, and the player is just like, you know, influencing their actions, but from a storytelling perspective, they're very much an outside observer. They may have like choices in dialogue options to sort of like shift the story in one way or another depending on how it works, but not they don't usually tend to have as much impact on like the story overall. It's very much like if you took Fallout and compared it to a Telltale game. They're both very much about like dialogue and like choosing different dialogue options, but Telltale games are very much more scripted, very much more structured. I should have put a picture of that, but I didn't. So yes, as opposed to the projection that immersion that you get from blank slate characters, with defined characters, you get immersion via investment in like the characters and their stories and Your immersion comes from watching their stories unfold and forming bonds with these characters and all that good stuff that we get from storytelling. And as you can probably imagine, these generally feature in very much more narratively driven games, very much dialogue driven games, especially because it's very, very easy to show character in dialogue. It's kind of hard. Games don't really have very many other mediums to get character across. And if you do, you have to like build it specifically. It's kind of difficult to do anything outside of dialogue. Cutscenes are usually pretty common as well, but they don't have to be. As you can see here in Hades, it's very much a character-driven game. Zagreus has a very strong personality. He's like super witty, very sassy, I guess you could say. So he's very much his own person. And they managed to get all of that across specifically with dialogue and like, you know, combat quips and whatever, but that's not really, those are more just like little sprinklings of flavor on top. And I suppose one thing that should be brought up here if you are going with a defined character model is that you should try very hard to make the character likable, universally appealing, because a lot of different people are going to be spending a lot of time with this character because they're the player character. And that is going to be hell if they don't like them. And another thing that to keep in mind is that even with defined characters, projection will still happen, just to a slightly less degree than blank slate characters, simply because of the fact that you are controlling their actions, you are playing out their story, even though you are kind of an observer. The player is also like, they're like a active observer, sort of, so they do still have a role in the story, so projection will still happen, and you don't want people to be projecting onto someone that they don't like. That's not a very good experience for the players. So again, pros and cons. As you can imagine, this specifically works very well for character-driven stories. It also tends to make your narratives more compelling for the reasons that I've already brought up. It can also make your game a lot more memorable and marketable, as I brought up earlier. Your characters are probably going to be a huge part of your game's brand. That's like how you tend to set your games apart, is specifically with characters, just because of those connections that people form with characters just as human beings. And it can also help to encourage audience engagement like once they've finished with the game. So I'm sure if you can pick out any game that you can think of with a huge following, it's most likely a character-driven game with defined characters. Maybe not a main character, but they do at least have some good characters, because that, it sort of inspires people to like make art about your game and like just share their experiences, all that stuff. That tends to happen a lot more with defined characters and character-driven stories instead of, you know, just those typical sandbox games. Now, the cons, because of course there are cons, is that it does reduce player ability to project, but as I said, it will still happen, just to a lesser extent. It's a very much more involved process, especially from the writing standpoint. You have to make the character consistent. If they're going through an arc, you have to still make that arc consistent. You have to try to make them likable and relatable, because as I said, people are going to be spending a lot of time with these characters, and you don't want them to be forced to play through the game from the perspective of a person that they hate. And generally, not always, but generally, in character-driven games with defined characters, you can't just have the one character. You're going to need like maybe not well-rounded, but at least a present cast of several additional side characters, so that they can like interact with each other and you can get like opportunities where you can let their character shine through dialogue and all that. So it's in general just more harder and more time consuming, but I would argue that it's also more worthwhile because of that. All right. So, and then of course, this very much is not just like a black and white thing. It is a gradient. There are so many games.
That's a vanity project.
Oh, I'm sorry?
Hey, William, I think your mic is on by accident.
Oh,
Sorry about that.
you're good. Okay. So yeah, as I was saying, it's very much a gradient. Like you can have games that fall on the extremes, but the overwhelming majority falls somewhere in the middle. And what a lot of games will do is they'll have like a defined character with like, name, personality traits, all that fun stuff. But they'll be pretty mundane personality traits and generally positive as well, things that people would want to be like. So, compassionate, heroic. If you're going for like a very like emo anime route, it could be like, edgy with a tragic backstory, all that stuff, So they'll have a character like that so that there is something that they can do with it. They can still tell a story with that character, but it's significantly easier for the player to project their emotions and their feelings onto that character. Sort of an issue that can arise from this is if you're not careful, if you're just kind of like ticking off boxes on a relatability checklist, it can kind of make your character seem samey. It can make your story feel like boring or like, this has been told a million times. I've seen this character a million times. So like, I suppose what I'm trying to get at here is if you do this, you run the risk of falling into archetypical storytelling, which can be boring and like, unless if you put like a really interesting twist on it, like a lot of people have probably experienced that story before, so it's not going to be as compelling and you lose out on the investment. But that doesn't always have to be the case. If you are conscious about how you write your characters, then you can end up with the best of both worlds. I picked two good examples. We've got Joel from The Last of Us, the typical grizzled, unwilling father figure who eventually sees the error of his ways and like takes care of, ends up taking on a child figure, and he's a very admirable character, so that's sort of that projection, and they are still able to tell a story with him. And then conversely, there's Bastian, the kid from Bastian. So on the surface, he doesn't really seems like a blank slate character. You don't learn his name in the story, but they managed to do a lot more with environmental storytelling with his story. That sort of, allows you to glean some aspects of his character, but you're still allowed to sort of make his story your own as well. And this sort of follows sort of industry standards, I say, but this slide is also titled not very well. But historically in like storytelling as well as in just games, blank slate characters are considered to be, they were considered to be the norm. They were considered to be slightly more popular, specifically because that's what people thought people played games for, to project themselves into like new worlds, to experience like new things that they wouldn't be able to otherwise. So that was kind of the mindset that the games industry, specifically AAA, was in for a lot of like earlier games. But recently, I think in the last like 10 or so years, they've been shifting more towards like having more defined characters, having more character-focused stories and games, and even just character-focused aspects in games that like you wouldn't usually think you'd want or need characters in, like games like Overwatch and TF2. They very much have like characters, like very defined casts of characters, even though the genre that they're in, the sort of like, it's not battle royale, I'm blanking on the word, but like you could very easily get away with not having any defined characters in that genre, but they chose to like give each class like a personality and a character, and that sort of, I personally think that sort of helped with the longevity of these games, is like, you know, giving them a personality, giving players characters that they can latch onto, that they feel like they can relate to and that they like playing as. And so, personally, if you couldn't tell already, I do very much lean more towards the defined character sort of mindset, but that's also just kind of because of, you know, I'm very much about storytelling and that sort of thing. So, yeah, it's very much personal preference, but this is kind of how the industry has been shifting, if you care at all about that. And yeah, that's just about all that I have.